So before we begin, we can pay homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So it's good to see so many people online. I had thought that there'd be people in person as well. Well, there are two people in person, two other people. But this makes things easier because I can just look at the camera. So it's been about 2 weeks since our last Uposatha gathering, but this one is particularly special, at least for us monastics, because it's the end of the rains retreat. For those of us that began the rains retreat in the first full moon of July, we've now come to the end of it. It's been 3 months, so time flies, which is quite surprising in many ways. And it's interesting because here, at least where we are in Massachusetts, in North America, the rains retreat, or the end of the rains retreat, is coinciding with fall, with autumn. And in my mind, I'd always associated autumn with transition, with change, with ending. The leaves are turning color, they're falling. People are starting to gather up and store things for the winter. And I guess maybe just the way that I'd been living before, I didn't really notice that instead of a time of relaxation, perhaps, and a time of slowing down, things seem to actually be speeding up. There are more activities, more events. We're doing more traveling, funnily enough, more walking about, going from place to place, and people are, or at least have a renewed interest in seeing us or hearing from us or inviting us to meals and what have you. And in some ways, though, as far as the rains retreat is concerned, it makes complete sense. So traditionally, the rains retreat was meant to have monastics stay in one place for that period of 3 months. And in ancient India, that was, and still in Southeast Asia and South Asia, that was a time of the monsoon, so heavy rain, lots of storms. So it made sense to stay put, both for one's own safety, but also so that you wouldn't put creatures that are sort of out and about during the rain at risk of being stepped on or harmed as you're traveling. Once that ended, though, then monastics would start wandering again, start moving around from place to place, going from monastery to monastery, or living, moving from village to village or town to town. So the end of that retreat, that season, did culminate in traveling, in movement. And so I found it funny that the same thing seems to be happening here, even though it's not quite the rainy season, though it has been quite rainy in Massachusetts this summer. It's a time of activity. And yet at the same time, I've been reflecting on how this time of year for a lot of people still has those elements or those resonances of ending, of grappling with difficulties in a way that somehow doesn't always come out, say, in the spring or the summer. They're usually quite happy and joyful and excited for the sun and the warmth and the activities and the beaches and the parks, etc. But there's something about fall I've felt just even talking to people lately, that starts to become a little more somber, a little more serious. It tends to be a time where people start to remember, say, past memories, old heartbreaks, heartaches, uh, unresolved family circumstances. Some of that has to do with the holidays coming up, uh, dealing with loss, dealing with death, which does happen all the time. But somehow these feelings seem to stick around a bit longer when it starts to get colder, when it starts to get darker, faster, earlier. And when visually, anyway, things seem to be more readily decaying or falling apart. And I was joking to myself that it's for this reason that the singer Adele usually releases her albums in the fall, because people are just primed for crying to sad music about old romances lost or sort of failed. But this element of, maybe you could say, the sadness of fall is still paired with, in some ways, renewal or an excitement that I've also seen. People looking forward to healing the things that they've been carrying basically all year long, almost. We start looking forward to the new year, which happens on January 1st. And in this part of the world anyway, is one of the coldest parts of the winter. But I start to see that people have that energy in them as well, even though things seem to be falling apart. Things seem to be not going quite the way we would like. But when we start to turn inward, at least if we're doing that with wisdom, I found that in that turning, precipitated perhaps by the cold, by spending more time indoors, spending more time with oneself or just with one's family, then there's that feeling that it's time for renewal, time for recommitment. And on an Uposatha day, that makes complete sense. As a layperson, you might take more precepts than you usually would to recommit yourself to the practice, to recommit yourself to living a life in line with your deepest aspirations, you could say. And on Uposatha day, that's one chunk of time that you can truly dedicate to being that ideal version of yourself, if you will. It is difficult to do that every single day of the year. Things come up, we forget, we're busy, we have lots of obligations. But on this day anyway, even for 3 hours, you can say, well, I can practice these precepts, I can do some meditation, I can reflect on the Dhamma, reflect on the teachings. But this time of year is also a great opportunity to reflect on our lives. And as monastics, each Uposatha is sort of that. We're reflecting on our own commitment to the vows we've taken. We reflect on things that we've done the past 2 weeks that weren't in line with our precepts, and we confess them, we share them with our fellow monastics, and rededicate ourselves to practicing. But especially at the end of the rains, it struck me that this time is also a moment for checking in, seeing, well, now that we've spent 3 months or so living in one place for the most part, practicing together, practicing quite diligently. Some monastics take on special practices, special studies, special intensive meditation retreats. At the end of that, the question is, well, What do we do next? What do we do now? And for each person, each monk, that answer is different. It might mean going somewhere else for a time, learning from other people, other places, other teachers, or it might mean staying put if the conditions were actually quite great where one was. It might mean that on or during those 3 months, we discovered something new, something interesting about ourselves and the direction we want to take our practice in. And so to me, just even walking, say today, from a meal invitation that we had down this very leafy, cool, winding road, the path sort of reopens again, both in a literal sense, but even metaphorically, emotionally, when we take time to reflect on a day like this, or really any day, asking ourselves why we're doing something, why we're practicing, why are we here, really? Why have we taken on the precepts? Why have we taken on the vows that we have? And what direction do we see ourselves moving in? For wandering monastics, that question is obviously quite important almost every day. The question of where we go next is sometimes determined by, having to eat. So we will go where there's food. But other than that, it's the question of, well, where will my practice grow? Where will my practice improve? And what conditions do I need for that? And the same question is relevant for lay people as well. It's relevant for anyone. So that's one perspective that I'd invite anyone listening to sort of take, which is to use these nights, these Uposatha days, as moments for not just rededicating ourselves to the practice in perhaps a performative way, but also as a time to reflect and to question ourselves, really, about how we've been living, how we've been practicing, and how that's been bearing fruit in our lives. I was thinking today, because the topic of death has come up quite a bit. I mean, it's been pretty common this year, the past 2 years, really, since the pandemic. The very real phenomenon of death has become more present in people's lives than perhaps we all would have wanted. Almost no day passes where one hears of this person or another person who's gotten sick or even passed from one illness or another. But now with COVID, of course, that's increased. And for some people, I would say most people, that's very heavy. It's one of life's hardest questions, really, is how do we grapple with the fact that not just the people around us get ill, get incapacitated and pass away, but that we ourselves too will one day experience that. It's very easy to sort of look to the outside and see these things happening and relate to it in somewhat of a detached way, but it's another thing entirely when that starts creeping closer, whether it moves from just news headlines to goings on in the town we live in, to our own families, to our own loved ones, to our own very close relatives, and then to ourselves. And it's a question that people have been asking themselves since the time of the Buddha, and I'm sure from earlier as well. And yeah, the question is, what do we do? There's a sutta where the Buddha is talking to King Pasenadi, I believe, or King Bimbisara. I can't remember which one, but basically It's a sutta where the king approaches the Buddha and he's like, well, this Buddhism thing is great, but I'm a very busy person. And I practice the precepts from time to time, and I'm generous and I'm kind, but I have other things to do. I have wars to wage, people to take care of, money to make. And the Buddha says, that's interesting, basically. But let's consider that you were in grave danger, that from all corners, from all directions, mountains were coming in and closing in on you. If that were the case, how would you live your life? And the king is like, well, if that were the case, then I would really dedicate myself to the precepts. I'd really dedicate myself to being generous, to being kind. I'd really practice diligently and try to understand this body, this mind. I'd really try to understand the practice. And the Buddha is like, well, I hate to break it to you, but that is the case. The mountains that are closing in on you are the mountains of aging, illness, death, separation, dukkha, pain. And so when things are going very well, it's easy to forget, obviously, that that's the case. And when things aren't going so well, it's easy to push the thought away. But I found that in turning to these very stark realities, we find that there is an opening, that there is both the heaviness, but also the question of recognizing that there's something that can be done about the pain, about the sorrow, about the anxiety. And yes, the traditional answer to that is to rededicate oneself to the practice, recommit oneself to the practice. But all of those practices of morality, of virtue, of kindness, of generosity, of wisdom, equanimity, they're all pointing to developing the heart. They're all pointing to understanding our minds, pointing to understanding how we interact with the world and how we interact with the things that are happening in the world. So there can be quite horrible things going on all around us, painful things, upsetting things. And the Buddha would say that, yes, all of those things are happening and they're all real, true, and they're even unpleasant. But how can we relate to those things where we don't increase the unpleasantness, we don't increase the suffering there? In one simile, he likens it to getting hit with a dart or an arrow. And sometimes our reaction to getting hurt, say, for example, is to hurt ourselves even more. Whether it's by reacting to it in a way that's not useful, whether it's by thinking that what we're doing to fix the problem, or rather thinking that we can do something to fix the problem, but actually making it worse, or even by ignoring it. And he's like, we don't have to do all of that. That the course or the remedy for getting hit with an arrow is to look at the wound and understand the steps that we can take to heal it and to do that. Yeah, that's the Noble Eightfold Path in a nutshell. But that definitely takes some faith, some courage. If we trust our doctors, then we might not think that it takes much to, go to the pharmacy and fill the prescription they give us. But even that takes some faith. I, for example, have no idea what's in any pill that I take. I know what it's called and the name of it, but I haven't seen it made. I haven't seen the effects that it has on anyone else. I trust that my doctor, who has hopefully trained, practiced, and studied, knows what he's talking about. And so when a prescription is given, I readily go to the pharmacy, fill it, and take my medicine and watch and see if the results are the results that are stated. And if it works, I'm happy. It doesn't necessarily take that much courage because, well, my family is a family of medical practitioners of one kind or another. So I already, you could say, have some amount of faith, have some amount of trust, conviction. But when it comes to spiritual practice, it's a little more difficult. And I think some of that difficulty comes from the fact that it takes sometimes a lot of our own self-motivation, self-determination, courage that we have to sort of well up from within. That when the Buddha says that there's already so much relief in looking at a painful feeling rather than reacting to it, that we can actually do that. Sometimes it sounds completely nonsensical that to deal with, say, sorrow is not to just go to Netflix or a song, not necessarily to eat our way out of painful feelings. Sometimes not even necessarily to go anywhere or speak to anyone, but sometimes just to look at the mind and look at what that experience is like, and to see that just in looking, just in acknowledging, just in recognizing, there's already so much relief. That simple act can take a lot of courage, a lot of faith. And I wonder, even for myself, if sometimes that act of looking at what's painful is scary because we're afraid of what we might actually see. I remember once, this was pre-pandemic, before I was living at the monastery, I was just in a funk one day, and seemingly for no reason. I had no idea, or I couldn't point to anything in particular why I was just feeling really down. And I remember waking up with that feeling and just lying in bed and like, just feeling heavy, feeling weighted, like I just could lie in bed all day. And I'd been practicing for a little bit already, a couple of years at that time. And I remember thinking to myself, you know what? I'm sad right now, and I don't know why. But I'm going to get up and I'm going to do the things that I wanted to do today, and I'm going to be sad and do them anyway. And for me, it was somewhat of a shift from how I would normally operate, which was either one, ignore that I'm feeling that way and, you know, go about what I'm doing, sort of dismissing it or suppressing it. And that would just inevitably make things worse. Or on the other hand, I would just lie in bed all day and listen to some Lana Del Rey, watch some Netflix, read something sad or what have you, which was also another way of ignoring it by indulging it. So ignoring it by not actually looking at it, but thinking that I was somehow expressing it or expelling it from the body by performing it. And that wasn't working either. And that moment where all I said really was, yeah, I feel sad. And if someone were to ask me how you're feeling, I would tell them the truth. And if they would see it, then I wouldn't hide it, but I would still do what I needed to do. There was relief there because I wasn't afraid of facing it. And then with that relief, funnily enough, things that could alleviate the sadness or the pain just popped up. I didn't have to really think about it that much. whether it was going for a walk, talking to a friend, listening to a talk, reading a Dhamma reflection. The way out of that pain or that suffering arose because I gave it the opportunity to sort of speak for itself even. And what each person needs to deal with that is different. But I would say that if we don't give it the opportunity to come up, then we won't ever truly know what will be useful for us. We won't ever truly know what will be helpful. And in the context of what we're practicing here anyway with the Dhamma, we won't actually give the teachings a chance to take effect. The other day, we were offered a meal, which was very wonderful, by 3 people. And it was just palpable, the amount of generosity and kindness that was in the air. One of them was sort of looking around the camper that we use as a little meditation space and storage space, and checking if we had medicine, if we had enough supplies, if the roof wasn't leaking, if there weren't mice infesting our space, basically making sure if we were okay. It was very sweet. And obviously making sure we were fed. But their family had just experienced the loss of a pet that they really cherished. And it came up in the course of the conversation, and we offered a blessing in memory of the pet. And one of them just started crying, tearing up during the chant. And afterwards, when we finished chanting, he apologized, which was interesting because I think for the 3 of us anyway, the monks were like, oh, there's nothing to apologize for. That's the feeling in the mind right now. That's the difficulty of loss. That's the difficulty of change and of pain, that these feelings will come up. And I felt that, or rather I felt somewhat honored that could be a space where one didn't have to feel embarrassed or ashamed that they were actually feeling something uncomfortable, feeling something difficult. But in being able to feel that without reservation and to be in a space that could hold it was already, I think, one step on the path to healing. And the Noble Eightfold Path is really, if looked at one way, the path to healing. Healing from the things that disturb us, disturb our minds, disturb our hearts. But like any other course of healing that we take, whether it's healing physically because we've suffered an injury, or even healing mentally, that first step does take a lot of courage, a lot of faith. Luckily, we have community, and luckily we have other people who are practicing who we can sort of look around and see, oh, well, it's kind of working out a little bit for them. So maybe there is something there that I can try and get the same result. That's sort of the first thing that really drew me to this path, was seeing a monk years ago, maybe this would be 6 years ago almost now. And just seeing how peaceful, content, and happy they were. And it was interesting because having heard him speak about his life and his experience and what he was going through, it wasn't absolute happiness. It wasn't happiness that was exempt from, say, the suffering that was happening in his life or in the world, but rather it was a happiness that he was able to cultivate, even though there was pain, even though there was sorrow, even though there was difficulty. And at that time, I was a complete mess in my own life, just being pushed and pulled by everything that went wrong or seemingly didn't work out. And so I wanted to figure out how one could be happy and hold all of these things that normally make us shut down. So with community, it's possible to see that this path works. It's possible to know that you're not alone. And luckily, as monastics, we usually find ourselves in some sort of communal setting or another, even if we're alone somewhere. It's not, in our tradition anyway, a practice of being a hermit, but it is a practice of always being connected to others. And in that, there's this shared practice, this shared path that can encourage us and lift us up. This is something that I saw just being here for the rains and experience, being supported by the community. But even as a layperson, there is that community as well. A number of you are on the Discord channel, for example, or you're gathered here for the Zoom meetings. These are all ways that community expresses itself. A little bit, with the 21st century spin to it, but nonetheless, these are elements of the practice that can support us in building the courage and the faith that we'll need to face the changes that come our way. So in sort of all the upheavals that have been happening with the change of the season, it's that element of togetherness and community, even though people are sort of on the move, that I've been noticing sort of as the undercurrent of all the tragedies and shifts and losses that have been happening, whether it's neighbors dropping off firewood so that we don't freeze to death, or seeing people who live miles away helping the elderly couple who can't do much for themselves anymore. Seeing people offer food to one another to help each other out, and being able to see these things because there is that connection and there is that ability to tap into people's lives in a way that offers an unconditional sort of attention. That is one of the blessings of being a monastic, really, to be able to give something to someone without expecting anything in return, or to even be able to receive something from someone without expecting that there's strings attached. But regardless, it's in those sort of communal relationships, communal networks, that we find that the practice can really encourage us, even when things are cold, even when things are dark. And so on a night like this, the Uposatha, full moon night in particular, especially at the end of the rains, it's been quite meaningful to reflect on how things have sort of gone over the summer, and how even in the changes that are happening now, there's still some of that warmth and some of that glow from the summer that stays within people's hearts. Kind of like the wood stove or the fireplace, it moves indoors. And it's in that sort of gathering around as a community as family, as friends, what have you, that it's possible to make it through the winter. And so I think those are all the reflections that I have for now. I hope some of that's been useful.
Andamayang Dhammakataya Sadhukaranga Dhammase
Sadhu, 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 anumodamani.